So, as already mentioned, so this is basically a talk that has very little of what we currently call mainstream economics. So even though I kind of teach and I do work in economics, this is not really in that domain. I'm basically going to spend some time talking about two very different models of people kind of coming together in villages in Bihar to move towards progress. So how can people help each other to kind of collectively act and kind of move out of poverty and towards progress? And I'm going to talk about how these two models are and what they can perhaps learn from each other, and perhaps point towards, how we can kind of have a third model, which is a combination of the two. My goal is to try and not solve all problems. I don't claim to be an expert on any of these issues, but to try and get you all and myself a bit to engage more with the problem of collective action. And that's the main goal of this. So we'll start with Mandesri Devi. This is Mandesri Devi. This is a photo actually from last week in Bihar. Mandesri Devi was sitting on that bench in the Samaj Parivartan Shakti Sanghatan office, and she was giving us this amazing discourse about the role of activism and the role of local politics in improving village level governance. So this is her. The amazing thing about Mandesri Devi, of course, is that she is completely illiterate. She comes from Dalit, scheduled caste background. She is part of, she grew up in the Ram Tola. She's in her late 50s, though, depending upon which government record you look at, she could be anything between 45 and 70. If you ask her, she says she's 60. And, she was someone who's extraordinarily articulate, and she's this kind of very important activist in the Muzaffarpur People's Movement, which I will talk about in a bit. But prior to 2011-12, I was talking to Mandesri Devi actually last week about where she was, what she was doing about 10-12 years ago, and she said, "Hum pashu palte the, bakri palte the." So we were basically goat herds. We were keeping animals in our house, and that was our main source of income. During harvest and during sowing season, she would also go and work on people's farms to kind of work as a casual laborer or a mazdoor. So that was her primary occupation. She said that, in those days, life was such that she got ration, her household got ration maybe 5 or 6 months a year. So ration is basically the subsidized, public distribution system based subsidized food program. And you're supposed to get it for 12 months a year. She used to get it for 5-6 months a year. And she said her life was very constricted. She used to kind of spend most of her time in the tola, in the village, and that's basically it. In fact, her exact words were, "Hum Muzaffarpur jaane darte the." I used to be scared even to go to Muzaffarpur, which was the district headquarters where Mandesri grew up. Mandesri grew up in this village called, actually Mandesri grew up in a separate village, but she spent most of her adult life in this village called Ratnauli. So the amazing thing about her is she went from being someone who I just described to being this activist who's so articulate and who has inspired so many other women like her to come out and question the local government. So what exactly happened is the question. And basically what happened was Mandesri Devi at some point came in contact with this man, Sanjay Sahni. In fact, she again described the first time she saw him very evocatively. She was walking around in her tola, and there's this kind of open clearing. In fact, there's a tree about half this size in this place called Salestan in her village. And this man was standing under the tree with a loudspeaker and a bunch of papers and calling out names. So she was curious, and she joined this kind of group of people who were kind of gathered around this man, Sanjay Sahni, and she was wondering what it was that he was saying. Turns out he was reading out names from a government list. Okay? And this list was of people who had actually worked on a government program and had drawn wages because they had worked on this program. The program, of course, is the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, or the NREGA. I'll come to that in a minute. But basically, Mandesri saw this man reading out this list, and like everybody else, she was watching, and suddenly he read out the name Mandesri Devi. And she said, why is he reading out, she was thinking to herself why he read out her name. And turns out that the local leader in the village, the elected representative who's called the Mukhya in Bihar, the Mukhya had kind of embezzled funds under her name by saying that she had worked on a government program, given a fake account, and had taken money under her name. This is a part of a government scheme. So that's basically the first time she bumped into Sanjay Sahni. And Sanjay Sahni himself was an activist on the streets of Delhi. So he was an electrician, no, sorry, he was an electrician on the streets of Delhi, very far away, very far removed from the world of activism. And by complete chance, he landed up in an internet cafe. I wrote about this kind of extensively in the book that Professor Ram Reddy mentioned. And by complete chance, he lands up at an internet cafe and he discovers the NREGA website. And this is a man who himself has not cleared class 7 standard, that is. And he discovers corruption in his village, and he's so inspired. He thinks he has landed up on the greatest scam in the world, decides to kind of give up everything and rush back to his village with all the papers bearing lists of names and wages, and try and ask people if they had actually worked on these schemes, or if, as was his hunch, all of this was corruption. So that's what Sanjay Sahni was doing. And so what is the scheme that the Mukhya of the village was embezzling under? Next slide. Essentially, the scheme is as I said, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. It is a government program that was launched in 2006. The amazing thing about the program is that it gives every worker in the village, anywhere in the country, the right to walk up to their leader and demand work. So this is not just a worker, I could be anybody in the village. If I'm unemployed and I want work, I can go up to my local leader and say, I don't have work, I want the money, I'm willing to work, give me some work. And that's basically the one-line summary of the scheme. The government is supposed to give this person work within 15 days, and the entire household can get up to 100 days of work. That's how it's supposed to work on paper. That's clearly not how it worked when Sanjay Sahni discovered corruption. In fact, people didn't even know the law existed. People didn't even know they had a right to demand work. And the Mukhya was so kind of corrupt that he and his cronies had given a fake list of names of real people, but who had never worked and done some fake projects and embezzled money in their name. Right? So Sanjay Sahni lands up in his panchayat, discovers corruption, tells people like Mandesri Devi that all of us should kind of come together to raise a stink about this issue. So we should all collectively act in each other's interests and kind of go complain to people. So through a series of very, very interesting coincidences and some sheer kind of stubbornness, obstinacy on the part of Sanjay Sahni, they actually managed to get an audit to happen in their village, and that's basically how the Muzaffarpur People's Movement was born, right? So what the movement does is, it goes to many panchayats across Bihar and essentially inspires people or brings people together, mobilizes them to come together and to demand what is rightfully theirs from the state, primarily around things like the NREGA. So in many cases, there's no corruption, but there's no work either, because people don't know. So the Muzaffarpur People's Movement has a group of many, many Mazdoors. Now there are up to 15,000 Mazdoors, workers that is, who go around demanding their local government to provide better NREGA work days, more ration under the public distribution system, and so on. Okay, so that's what it does. I'm going to give you a little bit more flavor on what the Muzaffarpur People's Movement exactly does when it goes to a new panchayat. Next slide. So this is, for example, a photograph from a mobilization meeting. So there are two ways in which the workers' movement kind of enters a new panchayat. One is that somebody from that panchayat has heard about the work that the members of the Muzaffarpur movement have been doing, and they contact them. They either show up at the office in Ratnauli, where Mandesri Devi is from, or these people kind of call someone, and that's how they kind of make contact with the movement. And then a team from the core team of Muzaffarpur workers who are part of the movement kind of show up at these villages and then talk to the workers there and tell them how to demand work under the NREGA, or pensions for the old people, or rations, or even ways to kind of try and improve the schooling system. So it's kind of completely organic. A lot of it is demand driven. Sometimes, of course, a team will just go to a new panchayat. So sometimes there are panchayats in the vicinity where they think, hey, this panchayat is ripe for some collective mobilization. And usually when they enter a meeting, what they do is they basically talk to new workers about the injustices they are facing. So the mobilization is the articulation of the mobilization is a lot about the problems people are facing, the kind of the apathetic local government, the fact that they're not getting what they're rightfully entitled to, the fact that public goods don't work, the school is broken, the Masterji doesn't show up, the Anganwadi is shut 4 days a week, and that's how they get people to come together. And then they say, look, you have all these problems, we've had these problems, why don't you kind of try and work with us, and we'll tell you how we've gone about making our lives better by collectively coming together. What do they do when they collectively come together? The first thing they do is they kind of petition the local state. So they either write applications either to the Mukhya or one level above, the block development officer, where they say, we, a bunch of Mazdoors, demand that we get what is rightfully ours in terms of work, or we demand that our ration dealer, who kind of steals 3 months worth ration from us, make sure that he gives us all the ration that we are entitled to, right? So you write a petition. Subsequently, what they do is, if these kind of petitions by themselves don't work, they go on strikes, and these strikes are reasonably common. So these images, they seem amazing, and there are lots of women here who are sitting in the district collectorate's office, who are saying, "Ladenge, jeetenge, we will fight and we will win." You would think that this is a one-off event, but actually, by my estimate, over the last 10 years, there's been an average of 4 strikes a year, either at the block or the district level, where these unorganized, informal workers come together and petition the state to kind of act. So they'll go to these district offices, they'll sit in a corner, they will sloganeer, they will chant, they will try and meet the collector, they'll try and meet the subdivisional officer, they'll try and meet the block development officer and try and put forward their demands, right? When all of this happens, it's not all smooth riding. You could imagine that, any bunch of people, but especially women mostly, or members from disadvantaged backgrounds, if they kind of act in this confrontational manner, they will face a lot of backlash, which is exactly what happens in these panchayats. So Mukhyas sometimes subject Mazdoors, workers, to verbal abuse. They sometimes, they go all the way to filing fake cases. Sanjay Sahni himself at one point had 9 cases against him of all kinds of things, including atrocities against scheduled castes and attempt to murder. All of these cases were fake, but these all existed, right? So this is how the local state kind of clamps down upon this. So the functioning of the movement, in some way, if you think about it, is very similar to all the great collective action movements we've seen across history. There's a period of struggle where you kind of petition the local state, you go on strikes. Then there's a period of truce. So the state kind of responds and says, hey, okay, you've made a lot of noise, we'll give you something. So you want work, we'll give you 10 days of work instead of the 40 you ask for. They then take the 10 days of work, they work for those 10 days, they wait to see if the state can do more. If the state cannot do more, they go on another struggle, right? So it's a struggle, truce, struggle prime framework where you kind of slowly escalate. And this is not a new strategy. 100 years ago, village activist in Gujarat, kind of working during the freedom struggle, described this whole process in this following way. He first said, "Lado, jo mile solo." So first fight, take what is given, bhogo, which is to utilize it, fir lado, fight again. So this is an old process. The antecedent of the Muzaffarpur movement lies in collective struggles across the subcontinent for over a century, right? So the one thing I want you to also keep in mind is, while these are people coming together to articulate and demand the local state, this is some kind of an informal workers' union also, because when eventually the citizens get what they are demanding for, a fraction of that, so 1 day of Narega wages, for example, is given back to the movement as dues. So it's like union dues in some sense. However, it's very different from the kind of union and factory unions that you see in factories where employers and employees bargain over wages, because this is with the local state and this is for informal labor, right? So, but this is in many ways an example of collective action. Okay, so this is the first model that I'm presenting to you. The other model is, let me kind of go back to Mandesri Devi for a second. So Mandesri Devi told me that, I was talking to her about all kinds of things. So she was telling me that a couple of months ago, I think this was in April, so 4 months ago, she had a leaking roof in her house, right? And she needed some money to kind of fix that. So what she did was, she spoke to her daughter-in-laws. She has 2 daughter-in-laws, Sanju Devi and Manju Devi, and she told them that, we need a few thousand rupees to fix the broken roof. What these 2 women did, they were part of local self-help groups. So they went to their self-help groups and they asked for a quick loan. These self-help groups give out loans, the small loans at very low interest rates with quick repayment schedules. And Mandesri Devi actually got Sanju and Manju to kind of collect some small loans from their self-help groups, and she fixed the roof. So this whole kind of loan taking, being part of self-help groups, is actually part of a completely different form of collective action, which is called Jivika in Bihar. Next slide. So let me spend a bit of time talking to you about what Jivika does. I've already told you that women kind of come together in groups, they meet, they borrow and lend money from each other, and that's how they help each other out, right? Some of the kind of salient features of this model is that first, it's completely state run. So the government of Bihar actually runs this, okay? Second, this got a lot of support from the World Bank, especially in terms of building an organizational structure where every single tola in Bihar, a tola is basically 300 households. So every single tola in Bihar has at least one self-help group. It's remarkable the reach of this organization. Third, the groups are small. They're usually groups of 10 or 12. Fourth, the loans are small. These are usually micro loans, not exceeding more than a few thousand rupees at best. And then fifth, of course, is that these are very ubiquitous, as I told you earlier. So these are the 5 salient points about something like Jivika. However, the most important thing I want you to kind of take away from something like this is that there are 1.25 crore women in Bihar who are part of the Jivika self-help group people. 1.25 crore women, next slide please. That is basically 60% of all households in rural Bihar have a woman who is part of a Jivika self-help group. That's a completely staggering figure because it means that the state, and this only anybody who's worked in the development space or who's worked in villages will tell you this, that only the state has that kind of reach. To kind of reach these many households over a period of 16 years is possible only through the state, right? So, so that's the salient thing I want you to keep in mind. And what I want to also say is that this is also therefore an example of collective action, right? You have women coming together to help each other. It's a cooperative form of collective action. And so what I want to kind of spend the next 2-3 minutes doing is telling you what the similarities between these two different models of collective action are. So first, of course, is that both are kind of at the village level, both are in rural areas, both feature mostly groups of people coming together to have meetings and then kind of discuss each other's problems. And so both also kind of use very similar vocabularies. It's actually fascinating to kind of go to a Jivika meeting and then go to a movement meeting, because some of those, you have a real sense of deja vu, right? You walk into one and both start with this kind of notion of what is called pariche, where you sit in a group and first you introduce yourself. So I will sit there and I will say, I'm Sharan, I'm so-and-so's, I come from this tola and this is what I do, right? And so everybody kind of goes around introducing themselves. So this is something that even the Muzaffarpur people movement workers also do. The vocabulary is similar along many other lines. I'll give you one other example. If Sanju Devi, Mandesri Devi's daughter-in-law, is a Jivika Didi in the village, that's the identity she goes by. Mandesri Devi herself is a Narega Didi. So she is the one who kind of mobilizes people along Narega lines, right? This is also, the other big similarity is that, women kind of play a dominant role in both of these. Jivika is entirely female run. The Muzaffarpur movement is about 70 to 80% women, right? The other very important thing in this context is that both these feature members from extremely disadvantaged caste groups. So when Jivika started, the objective was to go to the Dalit Tola in the village and start a group there. Okay? The Muzaffarpur People's Movement started with people like Mandesri Ram. Ram, of course, is a Dalit, but also there were Paswans and Sahnis, all of which either are Dalits or extremely backward castes. And those are the types of people who are most likely to work on things like Narega. Narega is very hard, toiling manual labor. It's only people who really want the work, who can work for like basically minimum wage, who will actually do it. And who are these people? They are women from these backgrounds. Okay? And the other big similarity between both Jivika and the Muzaffarpur movement are both feature extremely heartening stories of empowerment. So I'm going to tell you two very quick stories. One, which is a story that is actually recited in a paper by Paromita Sanyal and Vijendra Rao about Labho Devi. Labho Devi is a member of the Dome community. The Domes are actually, even within Dalits, they are the Mahadalits. They're extremely disadvantaged. They are the community that's actually called the gatekeepers of the heavens. Why? Because they are the ones who cremate the dead in villages in Bihar. Okay, this is also true of Eastern UP. So, so Labho Devi was a Dome woman. For most of her life, she stayed outside village society. But then Jivika came in, women like her got mobilized, and she talks very evocatively about encountering Yadav, which is Lalu Yadav, all these Yadavs are other powerful backward caste men. This backward caste man who kind of chided her and verbally abused her for kind of mobilizing other women of her caste and said that you should stay in your homes, you should not come out. So this is what she said. She recounted with much pride the slew of swear words she used to push back and how she finished him off with her speech. She ended by saying, and then at last, this Yadav man asks me, what's your name? I said, my name? Go anywhere in Ramganj and ask them the following. Labho Devi, Jivika Didi. Anyone will tell you who I am. Is that enough for you? Go to Prem Nagar block. Ask the BPM if he knows Labho Devi, Jivika Didi, and he'll tell you. Is that enough for you? Go to the district office, ask Varun, the DPM, if he knows Labho Devi, Jivika Didi, and he'll tell you. Is that enough for you? So this was the kind of response a Mahadalit woman was able to give a powerful OBC man in her panchayat, and a lot of this comes from the empowerment that a space like Jivika gives you. Women come together, they finally have some sense of identity that's separate from, husbands and daughters, and they're able to kind of work in their own spaces. This is a whole new space for them, right? I document actually a very similar story of empowerment in my book, and I was there to see this. We had actually taken a group of women from a panchayat in Muzaffarpur who had a wage dispute with their local bureaucrats, and so they wanted to petition the Rural Development Secretary. Now, the Rural Development Secretary is as far away from these women as you can get in terms of social hierarchy, class hierarchy, administrative hierarchy, any hierarchy you pick. It's like it's the Timbuktu in some sense for these women, so far away that you can't even think about accessing them. Yet there we were in this magisterial old secretariat Patna building, in this big conference room. On one side, these group of 10 women, all kind of ready with their facts, ready with the knowledge that they are going to be heard by someone important, and on the other side, this ladder of local government officials. So the local panchayat secretary, the block development officer, the district rural development officer, all these people on the other side, and there on the center was the rural development secretary. And these women basically knew exactly what they were talking about. They told the secretary that, look, this is the minimum wage I'm entitled to, this is what I was paid. They knew exactly what their rights were under the scheme, and every time the local bureaucrat came back with some official language, these women countered him with equally smart and equally kind of correct official language. So there was a really nice kind of to and fro that I got to witness. And the best part about it was the secretary himself said he was astonished to see women from these backgrounds. He said he'd never seen a group of women be so articulate and be so confrontational in a setting like this before, right? So the stories of empowerment are very much part of both the Muzaffarpur People's Movement and Jivika. Okay, yet there are differences. And what are they? Well, let me kind of document three broad types of differences here. The first, of course, is the mobilization strategy, right? So let's start with Jivika first. In Jivika, I have already explained to you how the Muzaffarpur movement goes about mobilizing. Now I'll tell you how Jivika does this. With Jivika, first and foremost, people talk about money. It's about women coming together to save small amounts of money so that they can help each other. So money becomes the center point of the mobilization strategy. Jivika is at its core a micro lending platform, right? So this is important because this bestows not just a space but a whole bunch of skills that many people say in the Muzaffarpur movement don't really have, which is like managing accounts, bookkeeping, managing finances, debating with their husbands on how money should be spent. So all of these things are kind of learnt in this process, but money still is very central to the mobilization process, especially because every time a new self-help group is formed in a village, 30,000 rupees are sent as initial capital, and that capital is indirectly funded by the World Bank, right? So you have this structure where money becomes very central, and that's how people come together. So that's one. I've already told you that the Muzaffarpur movement mobilizes around stories of injustice, about how people should come together in order to confront a local state that simply doesn't listen. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is the collective identity. Jivika Didi often kind of first sees herself as a woman kind of fighting against a extraordinarily oppressive patriarchal system, which is extremely important in this context. There are fantastic stories, as I've told you earlier, of women kind of fighting against the male-dominated society that they live in. But the Sangathan Sathis or the Muzaffarpur movement workers often see themselves first as Mazdoors, workers, right? This is not to say that no Jivika Didi sees herself as a Mazdoor or no Jivika Didi comes out, but on average, the Sangathan worker is much more conscious of their identity as a Mazdoor, as an activist, as someone who kind of has a role to play in not just improving their own lives or the lives of other women, but workers, but the old, but the infirm. So there's a bit more. The identity is a bit broader, while also taking away from the gender angle a bit. So there's a contrast there, and there's some very nice academic work that talks about this. I can refer the interested person to both two very interesting articles on the space. But the third big difference, and I think that's the one that I really want to spend some time thinking about, is scale. The Sangathan operates in the Muzaffarpur movement is in Muzaffarpur, which is one district, with maybe some spillovers into neighboring blocks in 2-3 other districts. There are 15,000 families associated with the Muzaffarpur movement. I've already told you there are 1.25 crore women and families associated with the Jivika movement. So the scales are very different, right? So 3 big differences: the way they strategize and mobilize people, the nature of the kind of identity, and thirdly, the kind of size of these 2 very different movements, right? And so the question then I'm kind of going to do next is to try and then say that, look, I've shown you that these two models are very different. Can they learn from each other to kind of help each other in this path from poverty to kind of empowerment and progress and prosperity? So that's the kind of big question I'm going to try and answer. To the impatient, I'm going to anticipate the answer I'm going to provide, which can be pithily summarized as it's complicated. Okay? So, so first, before we go on, let's kind of think about this, just theoretically. Can Jivika, can this, women's self-help group movement ever become truly more radical? Just theoretically, what does that mean to be more radical? Can a Labho Devi, who kind of confronted her Yadav strongman in her village, can she ever become the norm, not the exception, not the story you will highlight in a newspaper article, but actually every single woman, right? And for that to happen, I think it's hard because Jivika is run by the state. The state forms these self-help groups. Why is it in the state's interests to have these women then start questioning the functioning of the state? Right? Just the logic of the whole process is kind of antithetical to the purpose of how the state should function. I'm going to give you 2-3 examples of what I mean by this. Think of the RTI, think of the social audit schemes, which actually do a great job in Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, or think of even the grievance redressal program that I've studied earlier. All of these are examples of the government saying, come scrutinize me. I'm opening myself up to your scrutiny. And in paper, these are extremely powerful laws. Okay? These actually give citizens the right to do all sorts of questioning. But we all know that's not what happens actually on the ground. Right? The distance between what's on paper and what actually happens is pretty vast. Think of the Lokpal movement, right? The one that kind of propelled people like Arvind Kejriwal to power. Where is the Lokpal in Delhi? Why is Arvind Kejriwal not talking about the Lokpal anymore, even centrally? What happened to the Lokpal that even, the RSS and all these kind of right-wing people also kind of championed in the early 2010s? At some point we forgot it because once you come to power, we don't want a Lokpal around us. So anything run by the state that features the state opening itself up to questioning will always kind of be dampened by the state itself, and therefore the corollary of that statement is that the state will never want Jivika women to be super radical. Okay? That's the first kind of proposition I'm putting forward. I'm happy to hear people say that they disagree. The second thing I'll say here is that While I have said that, I'm going to kind of complicate that a bit more and say that Jivika is different from the RTI and the grievance redressal and all of these things because Jivika is ground up. The self-help group movement is in every household. It brings people in these villages together. It's not the state which sits in Patna or sits in Muzaffarpur or anywhere else saying, come scrutinize me. It is women sitting together and talking about issues. So there is definitely some scope for some mobilization of this sort to happen with Jivika women, simply because Jivika is just too big and there's a lot of kind of ground up strength that it brings that makes it very different from these other things I talked to you about. Okay, so now I kind of want to say how can we make Jivika more radical? I've already told you can't make it super radical, maybe, but maybe there's a chance. So what are the ways in which you can kind of make Jivika a little bit more questioning, move from a completely accepting space to a much more questioning one? Okay, and the first big way I'll say it is to lower external support. If you, and I haven't told you this, so I'm going to tell you this now. If you think about how Jivika is structured, it's run by the state and funded by the World Bank. It's completely mollycoddled by the state. It exists in this parallel bubble that is very separated in some sense from local government institutions, from the Gram Sabhas. There's no real pressure on the Jivika women to actually show up on the Gram Sabhas. There's no real pressure on them to kind of actually question the local state in any significant way, because they are funded and they have their own hierarchy that is separate from local government institutions and separate because there's so much money coming from outside. A traditional self-help group often doesn't even have the initial capital of 30,000 rupees that the World Bank gives to start a Jivika group, right? Once you start lowering the external support, both from the state but also from external agencies like the bank, Jivika women is my hypothesis, and I'm putting this forward to you without having any evidence to back this. So I'm, again, very open. This is all open to criticism. But Jivika may actually encourage its women to kind of come out into their own a bit more. Right now, they are kind of completely protected by this kind of parallel structure that Jivika has. Okay, so that's my first proposition, and this is not some radical new idea that I came up thinking about when I thought I'll give this talk. This is something that many people, even within Jivika, recognize, that you need the state to kind of recede a bit and the external support to recede a bit for these women, give them the space to blossom and bloom. So that's one. The second is kind of more synergy between places like Jivika and the Muzaffarpur People's Movement. Right? I've already told you that the women in these Muzaffarpur People's Movement are kind of much more different, much more radical, much more confrontational. So maybe there is a way in which these movements can be much more involved in Jivika itself. Again, I don't expect the state to do this consistently, but maybe there is a space. The reason I'm kind of confident is Sita is here in the audience, and she was telling me even earlier today that, there are groups like the Mahila Samakya that have done very good work trying to work with women in Jivika in small areas like 120 villages, and trying to work with them to question their system a bit more, right? So this is in 120 villages. Within 6 months, she was telling me that people started fighting back, people within Jivika, right? And they had these monthly meeting systems where these women's group kind of introduced topics like women's rights, how to fight domestic violence, how to kind of reach institutional schemes like the NREG and the PDS, how to actually do some kind of protesting, how to do roadblocks, right? All of these things a women's group, which was separate from the government, could actually try and do to make Jivika a slightly more radical space. So this exists, the space exists. I think given the reach, given that you're reaching every single tola in every single village in Bihar, there is a lot of scope to kind of make this a bit more radical. And finally, I've already spoken a bit about this before, Jivika has to be more tightly linked to local government institutions. A graduate student of mine actually has this really interesting piece of work, which is still a working paper, so all results are subject to the usual conditions. But basically, he shows that due to Jivika alone, 3,422 additional women contested panchayat elections in 2016. So just the fact that these villages, at that point Jivika had not reached all villages, so he looks at villages where Jivika had reached, compared them with villages where Jivika didn't reach, and found that in the villages that had reached, over 3,000 women had ended up contesting. You would think that's an amazing number. I agree. I think it's a very heartening result. But 100,000 people contested local elections in 2016. So 3,000 now is 3% of that. Okay. The other thing I'll say is most of the improvement in contesting elections at the local level because of Jivika happens in places that were already reserved for women. Actually, mostly for places that were already reserved for Dalits. So Jivika empowered Dalit women to contest elections, but in places where there was reservation for Dalits. Right? So it still doesn't mean that Jivika has completely radicalized society in such a way that many people are coming forward and kind of claiming their space, but there is some improvement and there's much more scope to do much more. So that's basically what I think Jivika can do to kind of go forward. What can things like the Muzaffarpur People's Movement do? And there, I think that, the first thing that they can try and do is to kind of learn how to build an organizational structure. The way the Muzaffarpur movement runs, and that's why I started this story with two individuals and not necessarily a structure. With Jivika, I didn't really give you a story. With the movement, I gave you two individuals, Mandesri Devi and Sanjay Sahni. The movement still runs like a political party where Sanjay Sahni is the main face. At least he is the brains, may not be the face, because often he doesn't show up at these government offices for the protests. He encourages women to go out, but he's still very much the brains of the movement, partly because the movement has panchayat level units, but no real pyramidal structure where there's a higher tier and then a higher tier beyond that. So the fact that there's no organizational structure, which is kind of central to how Jivika functions, means that the movement it doesn't become a fully democratic space and is somewhat inefficient in the way it functions, right? So if you have like one person having to think about everything all the time, there are problems with that model. We all know that. We live in this country, right? So and so I'm going to kind of leave you with one thought here on this. Next slide, please. And this is something I've been grappling with for a while, which is that should we expect places like the Muzaffarpur movement to actually scale up? What is the ideal model? At least as per what I'm trying to tell you, the ideal model is you have radical women within Jivika in every village. That could also happen if you kind of make the movement kind of bigger and bigger and scale up. I think there are two problems with this kind of way of thinking. The first is, other than one particular collective action movement I'm going to talk about at the end of the talk, for the most of where we are today, all these movements are kind of geographically located. So the movement, Muzaffarpur movement is called SPSS, Samaj Parivartan Shakti Sangathan. That's the main organization. This has been inspired by MKSS, Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan, which is the very famous Rajasthan Aruna Roy Nikhil Day Run movement. But MKSS also works only in 2 districts. MKSS served as an inspiration for JJSS in Bihar, which works in again 2 districts, which then serves as an inspiration for SPSS, which is the Muzaffarpur movement. So how these movement works is they're very locally structured, they solve local problems, and maybe there should be no real pressure on these movements to kind of increase in size. Maybe what they should do is continue to kind of act as models that work in local areas. So that's one question, and that's one thing that that's how I think about these movements often, is that many of them need not actually scale. The way they're structured, especially the more organic ones. I mean, for all my criticism of lack of organizational structure in the Muzaffarpur People's Movement, Sanjay Sahni himself is a class 7 pass. To expect him to kind of build institutions is a bit harder than expecting people like us who kind of gone through, who have engaged with institutions in a structured way all our lifetimes to kind of do this, right? So sometimes when movements are organically structured, maybe they don't need to scale. Or maybe they don't need to be as big as the others. But I'm going to also say one other thing, and so next slide please, which is that one kind of natural way, next slide, yeah. Whoa, do we get stuck? Yes, one kind of natural way for these people of these people's movements to kind of move to the next level is to contest local elections. Just like the Jivika women contest elections and win elections and become part of government, what is wrong if people of the movement also do the same thing? I asked Mandesri Devi this question last week, and I also asked her this when the ward elections were happening 7 months ago. I was again talking to her in Muzaffarpur, and I was asking her this. The first time she said, "Hum andar jayenge, to lalchi ho jayenge. If we go enter the government, we'll become greedy." I told her that अगर आप ऐसे सोच रहे हो तो आप नहीं होंगे. If you're thinking like this already, you will not be greedy. And she said, no, that's not true. I have seen so many members of the movement want to kind of enter government, and once they enter government, they kind of then become against us. Why is this such a clean phenomenon? Because the movement's natural intention is to work against the local state, and so these are almost like, to expect the movement now to become the local state is kind of taking away the central meaning of what the movement itself is, in some sense, right? So that's, I think, one of the problems. That being said, I am still very hopeful that the people like in the Muzaffarpur movement actually enter the local state, because I think the state has a kind of reach that it's very hard for any organization, any set of activists to have. And so entering the local states, not all of them, Mandasri also told me this, that you are pushing back so much, don't you think that आपको नहीं लगता है कि हम जैसे लोग बाहर से थोड़ा pressure डालना चाहिए? Don't you think that people like me should be on the outside putting pressure on people in government in the inside? I said, yes, there should be some people like you, but there should also be some people like you in government, so that they can work with you and kind of try and help things, improve things from the inside. So there's a lot of interesting questions to think about in that direction. My own bias is that, because I work a lot with local government, is that you have to improve functioning of local government to improve local democracy, and the way to kind of do that is to have people like Mandasri Devi in government. Okay, and so this is so basically what I'm trying to say is both these models, Jivika and the Muzaffarpur movement, is kind of filled with possibilities, the potential to actually transform the ways lives are lived. And you don't need 20% growth, and you don't need thousands and thousands of crores of rupees to actually achieve some of these wins, in some sense, right? A lot of these wins are in the social space, some of them in the economic space, and a lot of them can happen just by redistributing the pie as it exists. And so that's something I want to kind of emphasize in this talk. I want to kind of end on the note by saying that I showed you, next slide, I showed you two models of collective action, of people kind of coming together and achieving staggering things. Let's kind of step back and ask, why should we care about things like collective action, right? I'm going to give you one reason. I've given you many in the talk, but let me give you one big reason that I think going forward, we should really think about things about like collective action. These models offer a very important lesson. They offer the possibility of an India where people are not focusing on the divisions prevalent amongst them between groups of individuals, but on the possibilities of coming together. Again, I'm not saying that these models are always, completely caste and creed free, but at the heart of what these models are trying to do is to say that we must come together in order to kind of progress and prosper. And that's something that I strongly believe in, partly because we've shown the world perhaps the biggest collective action movement that has ever happened, which is the Indian freedom struggle. The country was birthed on the basis of this movement, and this is more staggering than anything else, because it kind of saw replicas, kind of ripples that kind of shook the entire world. So in fact, I would end by quoting Gandhi, saying that in a gentle way we can all together shake the world. And now in this India, more than ever, we need to remind ourselves that we have to come together, and the way to kind of progress is not by dividing us along different lines, but actually coming together. Thank you.
Just pose two questions to you. One is, you title the talk as, is there a third way? Okay. Supposing we ask you that, look, both these have got their individual strengths. Why are we trying to fuse them? You can say, as you said during your talk, how do they learn from each other? But why should we look at scaling up the Muzaffarpur movement, for example? I mean, for example, you said that MKSS was in 2 districts, then it's been adopted by a couple of districts in the other districts in Bihar, and then in Muzaffarpur. So likewise, we've had SHG groups all over the country. So why should we look at a third way? Can't we look at both of them independently? The second thing is a kind of more functional question. Now, should we expect more from SHGs? Now, SHGs have been around for 20 years. I mean, in a sense, they began in the old Andhra, I think, undivided Andhra. They have functioned, they have done well in many respects, maybe they can do more. But why are we burdening them with, carrying out collective action? I mean, shouldn't that be the job of other organizations, other movements? They have shown that they can do a limited amount, I don't mean to decry their success. They work in certain ways, essentially as welfare program in a sense. Why are we asking them to organize, agitate, stand for elections? I don't know if you would have something to say.
So this is a great question. I was kind of practicing this talk that was a thought that came up, not just by me. My wife also asked me the same question, so this is very valid. I think the one thing I'll say here is that the SHG movement in Bihar especially is subject to the problems that you're saying also, because SHGs are now kind of asked to run call centers, start Didi ki Rasois, like all kinds of things. The Bihar government, if they have a problem they cannot solve, right now their answer is throw an SHG at it and see what happens. Okay, so clearly by that logic, I think you shouldn't burden the SHGs with much more. That being said, what I'm trying to burden them with is kind of something different, which is that you want to leverage the space not so that they run government programs or they do trainings of other people, but to kind of do a bit more than that by kind of coming out and questioning and this one and trying to build build a slightly better world for all of us. Again, but let me kind of be more specific than that, which is that I think there is a lot of scope to do that. I think the scale is such that, and I'm not saying that they should be completely radicalized, but I think there is a way in which they can be encouraged to be a little less accepting of their role in society, a little less focused on just borrowing and lending, and maybe, and just like I kind of pitched in the talk, maybe there are ways in which you could kind of, even if you just remove the World Bank support a bit, maybe they'll already start kind of coming into their own a bit more. So I'm definitely not articulating a vision where every Jivika woman kind of becomes a radical social activist, or not even radical, but just a social activist. But I think that there's space to go a bit more than where they are right now, which is kind of very focused on borrowing and lending. On the movement itself, I agree with you. For a long time I thought, increasing size is the way to go about. People's movement gets more legitimacy the more villages they are in. Over the last few years, I have also come to kind of the understanding that maybe, no, these work as symbols, these have to be rooted in their own setups, these are organic, so you shouldn't kind of burden them with the bureaucratic organizational structure all the time. But that being said, I think what the people's movement can learn from things like the SHG movement is a bit more about just keeping record, kind of being more timely, kind of just like having some kind of an institutional structure where you have people at different levels, just a hierarchy of sorts, maybe even more democratic processes that SHGs also have in terms of getting different people to speak at meetings and stuff like that. So there are these smaller learnings they can do to make their space more democratic and a better path to kind of be part of this, and that's what I think they should be burdened with. But I agree with you that for a long time I thought they should also scale and they should increase in size, but now I'm a bit more circumspect about that.
Hi, I would like to think of Bihar, about Vasisht Narayan Singh, the mathematician and all that, and unfortunately Bihar has a perception problem which is plagued by violence and things like that. In such a scenario, probably this covered by the last questioner, but would you define your own degree of radicalness? Like what exactly are you?
That's a great question. I use the word loosely and I should be a bit more...
no, okay. I'm not challenging you, I'm just curious.
Yeah. So I think you're asking me what I mean by being more radical, right? So what I mean is just kind of moving towards a more questioning space. Is that what you wanted me to kind of define?
Yeah.
Exactly. So not just accepting of what happens around you, not just accepting of the institutional issues with, say, local government, with how schemes are kind of delivered to beneficiaries, with how members of elected representatives kind of behave with people, but to just kind of collectively articulate a bit more your rights, your space in society, and to kind of challenge the entrenched hierarchy. So that's broadly what I mean by radicalness.
And secondly, is this
Jivika movement is actually part of the National Rural Livelihoods Mission, so there are self-help groups across the country, but the Muzaffarpur People's Movement is something that should actually serve as some kind of a symbol, and I think that it has been for a while. Even just the fact that the movement has moved from, the members of these movements actually go to all possible. So Mandesri Devi has not just been to Muzaffarpur now, she has been to Rajasthan, she has been to Delhi, she has been part of protests, she has talked to workers from all different parts of the country. So that way, yes, they do act as symbols and they do act as inspirations for people even outside Bihar.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't quite agree with the idea that, why should Jivika become political? I believe that any such kind of grassroots level groups should become political, especially with respect to women, because when the government themselves are saying that, we're giving reservations for Sarpanch, and I don't know about other, I mean, I think pretty much is the case in any district or any village, that a woman sarpanch is never a woman sarpanch, it's always the male sarpanch. So where are women asserting their space? Where are women asserting their rights? Where are women asserting their presence in any local government system or in any decision making role? So Jivika, groups like Jivika, any self-help group for that matter, I think women should be given that space to become more questioning in nature, because otherwise there's this whole process of self-government, self-governing body or people contesting politics wouldn't make any sense. I mean, why would a woman be a sarpanch and not have that power to question or have that power to take decisions? So I believe that it has to scale, sangatans have to scale, and such self-help groups have to adopt such kind of mechanisms. But I doubt if governments will allow that.
So I'm broadly, as I told you, the one thing I'll say about women in government though is that even that is a process, and over time, and this doesn't go against what you're saying, but just kind of giving more texture to what you said. In 2006, when Panchayati Raj was first introduced in Bihar, it was the case that all women were just kind of fronts for the husband or for the father-in-law, and now increasingly it is the case that many women are actually kind of asserting themselves more in the political domain also. For example, one very small example is that women, now there's a rule that women have to come for panchayat meetings at the block office by themselves. The husbands are not allowed. This is a very big move in the sense that women actually get to go outside their villages. They go to be part of groups where they are people in power, where people in power treat them like people in power, and they get to meet other people in power. So this is a very big thing for many women, and that is happening, though not at the scale that we would want it to happen. The final thing I'll say on this is there's some work, and it's all kind of early stage, to suggest that even though many women continue to remain, in Bihar the term is Mukhya Pati. So the Mukhya is the woman, but the Mukhya Pati runs the whole show. The husband of the Mukhya runs the whole show, right? So even though the Mukhya Patis kind of run the show often, just having the woman as the Mukhya will, even if it's just within the household, they're kind of, if she's able to assert herself a bit more by saying, no, I think you should do this policy. Maybe she doesn't go out into the field or into meetings and making these claims, but maybe within the household, just the fact that she's the Mukhya allows her a slightly bit bigger say in how policies are done. And there's some early work that actually shows this from districts in West Bengal and Rajasthan, that where there's reservation for women in panchayats, policies actually are geared towards what women seem to want. This is early work. This has been challenged, this work, by many people, but I think that overall my sense is still optimistic, that we've come some way, we have a long way to go. Maybe the progress is not fast enough, but there has been change.
First of all, I'm ashamed to say that I've never heard of this movement called Jivika until you mentioned it. So there is another movement like this in Kerala called Kudumbashri.
Yeah.
So what is the comparison between these two? Kudumbashri, I think, is on a larger scale, much wider scale. And from what I understood of Jivika is that it is government sponsored.
Yeah.
And also it has the crutch of the World Bank.
Yeah.
And that does not apply to Kudumbashri.
So actually there may be other people in the audience who know Kudumbashri better, but my sense, it's definitely a platform where women are articulating their rights in a much stronger way than people in Jivika are. Some of the reasons for this are just historical and kind of location specific. So, women in Kerala are just in many ways much more freer. They have much higher literacy rates. They are much more empowered. And so when you create a platform for women to come together, you don't need the support of the of things like the World Bank to kind of actually create these platforms. Kudumbashri also, from what I hear, has a lot more women coming out and participating in local politics and all of that, which is not again the case in Bihar. So my read on that is that Bihar and Kerala are in some sense the two extremes in terms of this model, and ideally I think Bihar should get to a Kerala stage, but it takes a lot of other structural things need to change for something like that to happen.
I have never been and lived in a North Indian village. I have seen South Indian villages, but not North Indian villages. So when you were talking, the picture that I was getting in my head was the new OTT series Panchayat. Okay, my question to you is, how representative is Panchayat OTT series with respect to the Bihar village that you have seen?
Actually, season 1 is pretty nice. I think of season 1 as like an 80s 90s TV show which kind of showed a more sanitized version of how the world actually looked in these villages. So you know, it's not that the upper caste mukhya is a bumbling fool who, you know, kind of bumbles his way into doing things. Often these people are a bit more I don't know why the word coming to my head is savage. I think there's a better word, but they are a bit more aggressive. Yeah, that's the right word. So they're a bit more aggressive and they're a bit less accepting of what women want, even within the household. It's also benign because, you know, that mukhya in panchayat, the lead who plays it, kind of portrays this person as, in the end, having in their mind what is good for the people at large. My interaction with mukhyas in Bihar kind of makes me believe that that's, on average, that may not be the case. Even talking to certain good mukhyas, we had a conversation with a young mukhya last week. I mean, of course it's biased, of course everybody will say they are the nice people, but he said that, you know, in his block, which has 39 panchayats, he thinks there are 4 people who are kind of actually thinking about what people want and how to do things in a way that actually represent what citizens want, and for the most bit everyone's there in there for the money, right? So I wouldn't say that that means that mukhyas are all bad and that no development can happen through local governance. I think a lot can happen, primarily because I think the one thing that I'd say and that panchayat does really well is it tells you how everybody knows the mukhya. And if a mukhya walks in a village, everybody knows him or her. That is important because for local democracy, for democracy to work at some level, you need to have a leader you can see and question. The MLA you don't see, the MP you don't see. That's, I think, what makes local government institutions so unique. The final thing on panchayat is that panchayat secretary office is amazing. Now they're being built in Bihar in a certain way like that. 10 years ago in Karnataka, I was doing work in coastal Karnataka where I grew up, and villages there, of course, are like Kerala. So there was a computer center and everything. But for the most bit, no panchayat secretary will ever leave any job in Delhi to show up in a panchayat. Even if they don't have any job, they will not go to a village in the middle of nowhere and become a secretary, because I don't think that life is easy to live. So
the communist revolution in China and the French Revolution, and historically all the different things, and also in India also we had the farmers' protests. So, and also like you said, the different strikes, they are fairly common in India. But the thing is that why are we still lagging behind other countries in terms of development if strikes and collective actions are common in India?
It's not the only one. So that's one way to kind of think about it. You need a whole bunch of other things to make the state work. In particular, you need a set of enough resources. You need good policies. And while some of that could be tangentially influenced by local collective action for large-scale policy change, you also need like other structural reasons, like well-functioning education systems, hospitals and stuff like that. So I would say that protests alone and like striking alone is not sufficient to kind of get people all the way to progress, but it can kind of push people considerably in the path towards progress. So that's how I would see about it. I don't think it's the only way.
Okay, मैं मुजफ्फरपुर से हूँ. यहाँ पे मैंने SSG को करीब से देखा है. वहाँ पे SSG में CM दीदी होती हैं, CM पोस्ट फॉर हैंडल द SSG. CM जो है वो हैंडल करती हैं 5 से 6 ग्रुप को, जिसमें एक ग्रुप में 10-15 अप्रॉक्स महिलाएं होती हैं जिनका वहाँ पे जो रेकरिंग टाइप वहाँ पे पैसे जमा करती हैं, या जो उनको बोरोइंग 30,000 रुपीज़ फर्स्ट अटैम्प्ट में मिलता है उसको EMI में वो लोग सारे मिलके जमा करते हैं. वेयर सी कि वहाँ पे कई बार पैसे तो जमा होते हैं, मीटिंग्स होती हैं, बट उनके पैसों में गड़बड़ियाँ आ जाती हैं, कैलकुलेशन सही से नहीं होता है. जो CM होती हैं वो सिर्फ जाती हैं, साइन कराती हैं, कॉलम पूरा होता है, एक वो मैट पे बैठते हैं लोग और फिर चले जाते हैं. अब वो SSG के मेंबर्स को उतना केयर नहीं होता है, मैंने पैसा दे दिया बस और साइन कर दिया बस, लेकिन उनके पैसे में गड़बड़ियाँ हो जाती हैं. जबकि इवन हर एरिया के लिए SSG के लिए जो बैंक्स हैं जहाँ से उनको पैसे मिलते हैं, वहाँ पे बैंक मित्र भी जीविका की तरफ से आल्सो अपॉइंटेड देयर. अब क्या है कि वो चीज़ें हैं उसमें गड़बड़ियाँ आ रही हैं. सेकेंड जो आपने बताया रसोई जीविका रसोई वो करके जो हैं, उस तरह से बहुत सारे अभी पॉन्ड डेवलपमेंट के लिए, हैचरी आल्सो और पोल्ट्री फार्म के लिए डिफरेंट टाइप से एक गार्डन है जिसमें वेजिटेबल्स के लिए मतलब इस तरह की योजनाएं आती हैं. लेकिन मैंने ये देखा कि कोई भी कंटिन्यू नहीं हो पा रही है, सारी शट डाउन हो जा रही है. और वहाँ पे ऑफिस में जो बीपीएम है, आल्सो डीपीएम एंड आल्सो हेल्पर एम्प्लॉयज़ not working properly, but he has no work regularly. वो डिफरेंट मॉडल चेंज होते होते हैं. नाउ आप शौचालय के लिए जो पैसे मिले,
हाँ.
उसमें भी जो सीएम लेवल से है बहुत तरह की गड़बड़ियाँ हुई. किसी के पैसे किसी के अकाउंट्स में चले जा रहे हैं. सब में मैंने कुछ इन्वॉल्वेशन भी हुआ सॉल्ट आउट करने के लिए, तो उसका कोई सॉल्यूशन नहीं है. तो मेन थिंग क्वेश्चन इज दैट कि ये सब जो कंटिन्यू क्यों नहीं हो पा रहा है, उसमें शट डाउन क्यों हो जा रहा है. चूँकि मेरा कहना है जीविका से जीविका दीदी को जीविका क्यों नहीं मिल रहा है.
The bank thing that you're talking about, in fact, this is a proposal we made 2 weeks ago because I'm doing some work on improving data systems within Jivika. So one of the big problems with Jivika for the administration at the top is that they don't get real-time data on how much money is being circulated to these various groups. Okay, part of the reason is that these community mobilizers are basically tasked with the role of entering the ledgers on these systems. So I'm getting into really fine details, but bear with me for another second. So they have to enter these ledgers onto these, right now they have to give it to a data entry operator who enters them, and there's all kinds of problems. One of the things we proposed to them was that all the data, as long as money is going from and to a bank account at every level, at the district level, at the CLF level, you know what CLF is, at the VO level, at the SHG level, even at the member level, if money is going from bank account to bank account, you do not need a ledger to kind of enter all of this. What you just need is what is called bank exhaust data. That is, the bank itself has an electronic system that already has all the records of where the money is going. So one of the things we proposed to them, and I am only part of a team that can make recommendations, not actually do anything, is to kind of follow the Narega model. In Narega, the money from Delhi to the Mazdoor's account in Fulera, which is where Amazon's Panchayat was set, right? दिल्ली से फुलेरा तक पैसा जितना जाता है सब जाता है तुरंत आ जाता है बैंक सिस्टम से नरेगा वेबसाइट पे, ताकि सब लोग देख सकते हैं. ये जीविका में नहीं हो रहा है. ना सिर्फ वो, पहली बात ये है कि हाथ से लिखते हैं सब चीज़ें और फिर डेटा एंट्री करते हैं. दूसरी बात ये कि ट्रांसपेरेंट है ही नहीं. सो इफ आई एम अ जीविका दीदी, आई डोंट इवन नो what the official system says on how much money is being taken in my name. So in that regard, I think Jivika's financial system, and for a system, I mean, this is the topic of a whole different talk, I guess, but for a system that's so strongly based on people's money and being lending and giving money, to have manual records suggests kind of a problem that I think is pretty shocking. And they have amazing, otherwise their data systems are amazing. They track how many chickens someone has, how many goats, but those are all secondary things. I want to know if you got the money that was sent for you or not. So that I agree with. That being said, we did some work talking to some Jivika Didis, and their perception, and again this is all perceptions, we haven't done quantitative research on this yet, is that the amount of corruption is the amount of corruption you see in all everyday schemes, like in all schemes elsewhere. That being said, that doesn't excuse the fact that there is corruption and corruption should be solved. But I don't think that Jivika is any more corrupt than, say, in fact, I think it's less corrupt because of the small amounts of money than, there are less leakages than, say, other big schemes, especially infrastructure schemes like building roads. So that's my kind of answer to your question. We can talk offline also about this. I think it's a...
Yeah, I read your book and so many things fell in place also in Telangana, similar to Bihar, from grievance to Sangatans to many other things. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
So while I was thinking, one basic fundamental question was, for example, if you see, for collective action, Sanjay Sahni had to go back and initiate it, right? For me, and then he could build a collective, but Sanjay Sahni plays a big role. Of course, that's what your book at least, and I think so you mentioned in talk. So there is no templatized kind of a thing where such sangatans can actually, okay, fine, because in Telangana also there are unreligious issues. I don't see there's not much this thing, right? So I'm still wondering, at a broader scale, for the sangatans, so is it a few individuals or an individual from outside, or even Sanjay Sahni couldn't, I feel, would not have hit it if he could not have got in touch with Nikhil Day and that whole linkage, right, with the powerful, and got them to the village and made this other people accountable, right? So it is one of an incident, and a lot of other people would have tried and failed in similar ways. So is there anything for building sangatans, even MKSS also falls in the similar space, right? Few individuals who could make the powerful, come in and question. So I'm thinking, is there any other alternative ways? One is it based on few individuals who can do this way? Or, I'm just trying to
way here to someone. But for me, the Muzaffarpur movement is somewhat different because Sanjay himself was a class 7 pass, extremely backward caste, has still very strong roots in the village. This is his own village. And he was an electrician on the streets of Delhi. He was not some very well-to-do person. The average movement, like you said, has a retired IAS officer or an existing IAS officer whose conscience is woken up, or someone who studied in elite schools in Delhi and then gone abroad, been an engineer or a doctor, and then decided to give everything up and come back, right? A lot of the movements, like you're saying, comes from there. And so there I would say Sanjay is a bit different, but not, okay, so that's point one. Point two is, and I'm not saying what you're saying is wrong, but point two is, think of once it starts in 5 panchayats to go to the 6th, right? Sometimes it happens organically in a way that Sanjay doesn't have to do the calling in the 6th. The 6th person comes, shows up and says, this is what we want to do. A team just kind of shows up. Sanjay, yes, you're right, is still doing the big picture orchestrating, which is maybe calling up the district magistrate or something and kind of getting some pull. But a lot of the growth also seems to happen organically in a way that is not entirely reliant on one individual. So I would say that. But the broader question of can a fully organic movement ever take place, I would submit that perhaps, but actually the place for a fully organic collective action movement is also perhaps through elections and voting and being part of local government, right? I am somehow very biased towards kind of strengthening Panchayati Raj institutions and making them the place where you can get a lot of action. And so that's where I would also think about kind of, if I had to just allocate a fixed amount of resources, I would put some resources at least to try and cracking the problem of how do you make local governance better outside of movements too. That doesn't necessarily, none of what I said contradicts what you say, but these are my thoughts on that.
That Manthan is also a meeting where intellectuals come and address common people like us. And don't you think if these small movements are not there, suddenly we will find what happened in Sri Lanka recently? People entering the Prime Minister's house.
Prime Minister's house, is that what you're saying? It's a question I've never thought about, to be honest. So my thoughts are that maybe, right. Yeah, I don't know if the reason the Sri Lankan storming happened was the absence of people's movements there. There were movements. I mean, there is a strong left movement in Sri Lanka too. Yeah, it's simmering, but I think what precipitates a storming of the President's house or the Prime Minister's house is a serious economic crisis, the lack of food, the lack of very basic amenities that you need to kind of keep a society going, right? When you have something like that's when you see an outburst or this one of the sort that you saw in Sri Lanka. So that would be if I had to pick one reason, I would pick that as being one of the big enablers of something like that, not necessarily the absence of an outlet for people to kind of vent their frustrations.
How do you see the future of these two programs? And is there any scope to move out of Bihar and it benefit to the other states?
The Muzaffarpur movement actually over a 3-year period is expanding to 150 new panchayats. So they are actually thinking about increasing size. So they are still not satisfied with the explanation I gave you at least. So that's still going on, and so that's something that they are focused on at this moment, continuing to mobilize workers, to articulate their demands, go on strikes, all of the usual rigmarole. On Jivika, actually, the reason I also said World Bank and government should kind of step back a bit is because there is a sunset clause on how much support the World Bank can give, and they're slowly beginning to get into that phase. So, so given that that's going to happen, actually it's a very interesting time to be watching what happens there. Do these serve as inspirations for other models? As I told you, the Muzaffarpur movement does. I mean, these workers go all across the country giving talks, and not just giving talks, but being part of larger collective action forums and stuff like that. On Jivika, I mean, there's a lot of work already happening with the National Rural Livelihoods Mission, which creates self-help groups as part of it in many states. And so I'm sure, and I cannot, I'm certain that this is the case, that many Jivika people actually go and talk about specific things that they have been doing to people of other states. Usually, if you at the state government level, there's always bureaucrats going from one state to the other to kind of learn interesting models. So that happens.
But Jivika has really empowered women.
Yes.
And Sangathan also has done this. even in the United Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu, where these movements began with a lot of success, the empowerment has been very good. Unfortunately, they have become the targets of political
Right.
freebies.
Right.
And now the empowerment is actually going down, primarily because there's too much of dependence on political powers for getting freebies. So that, I think, is counterproductive to the entire movement. So
And
how
when
do
you say
look at that?
freebies, when you say freebies, do you mean like free gas and free housing schemes, or do you mean
Lots, not just that.
Huh.
I mean, giving money, a lot of cash is now flowing through the SHGs. A lot
to
of cash is
SHGs? I
coming.
see, right.
It's coming a lot. I mean, earlier they understood the importance of the collective movement of pooling money and then sharing debts and having responsibility for paying the debts. I mean, the remarkable repayment no other bank loans in this country have.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. The highest repayment is 99% also in many cases.
Right.
Now that is actually going down because there is a lot of political corruption in terms of making these SHGs disempowered. So that's a thing I'm really worried about. So when you say radicalization, this was my only caution. I think it's not going to be helpful that way.
Interesting thought, and I actually don't have strong views on this, so I'm also curious to see if, say, for example, the amount of money goes down, which is the reverse from the support from the World Bank and even the government of Bihar for Jivika groups. What happens? Who takes over? Will political parties take over and politicize the whole movement? We don't know. It's an open question, and yeah, I'm looking forward to, not looking forward, but I'm curious about what happens.